Welcome back to Luis's Stories, where we dive into the most disturbing horror tales from Reddit. Today, we're starting an intense, multi-part journey with I'm a receptionist at a plastic surgeon's, a story filled with dark secrets, twisted characters, and unexpected horrors lurking just beneath the surface. This one's a bit longer, so I've broken it down into parts with timestamps below, making it easier for you to follow each chilling chapter. If you're ready for a deep dive into the creepy unknown, make sure you're subscribed and have notifications on so you don't miss any part of this suspenseful tale. Now let's get started. When you walk into this office and the first thing you see is me smiling back at you with a big old smile, I bet you wonder why I'm the receptionist at a plastic surgeon's office. And that's a fair question. I sometimes wonder that myself. I'm Maggie, and I've been working at Dr. Harrison's clinic for about 3 years now. One thing to know about me is that I am no supermodel. I'm a little overweight. I like to use my mom's phrase of tastefully plump, but my whole life I've always been comfortable with who I am. I've never let anyone's words get to me, and as such, when I applied to work here, I fully expected to get rejected. But I needed a job and was willing to try for this spot. Meeting Dr. James Harrison was like coming face to face with a perfect work of art hung up in an art museum. His skin is flawless and smooth without a single mark or imperfection. While a little messy, his brown hair is soft and silky. And those beautiful eyes. He has eyes that are so bright green you could swear that they were glowing. I was so intimidated when I met him for an interview for the position, and his gaze was so intense, I almost felt like he would reject me on the spot. But instead, he gave me a happy smile and began to make conversation with me. And before I knew it, I was the receptionist here. Dr. Harrison is booked full almost constantly, and the flood of people that come in once we open our doors is insane. I swear there's a line at the door when I go to open it once we're finally open. Plenty of women and men check in and eagerly await their turn to be with Dr. Harrison. My job boils down to answering the phone, booking appointments, confirming appointments, dealing with payments, and the occasional coffee run. The waiting room sort of resembles a hotel lobby with how big it is, and to my knowledge, besides Nurse Rachel, it's only Dr. Harrison doing all the work. I don't think Rachel likes me very much, unfortunately. When I started my first day of work, the look she gave me was one I gave some food I discovered in the back of the fridge that I'd forgotten about. A mix of disgust and annoyance is the best guess I can give. Rachel also has flawless skin and hair, and she looks like she leapt out of the pages of a magazine. She only seems to tolerate me because I'm so close to Dr. Harrison. But when she arrives at work before him, she lets me know how much she hates me. Unlike her, though, I don't have time to hate her, especially since the phones are usually ringing off the hook with people looking to book appointments with us. Speaking of phones, there's also this old-fashioned rotary phone located in the back of my little receptionist area. Dr. Harrison has given me explicit orders that if it ever rings, I am to ignore all other calls and focus completely on answering that phone. So far, that phone hasn't ever rung, and it just sits there, ominously on the wall. When I say old-fashioned, I mean old. That thing looks like it jumped right out of an old black and white movie. I even had to ask him how I was supposed to answer it. Dr. Harrison let me decorate my reception desk however I liked, so I naturally brought all the knickknacks I could to the office. I'm a simple girl with simple tastes. I decorate the desk according to the season and the upcoming holiday, from Halloween decorations like pumpkins and skeletons, to Christmas decorations like my little tree and various stockings. But normally I just like to have pictures of my dog Sunny and a few pictures of my family. Well, I wouldn't be here on this site if strange things didn't happen at Dr. Harrison's office now, would I? Well, I have some stories to tell you folks. The first major red flag about this place is just how enthusiastic, let's say, the patients are. Once when I was trying to tell someone that they didn't have an appointment and that the next opening would be in 6 months, she very nearly leapt over the desk separating us and started strangling me right there. It took a couple of the other patients to restrain her and for the cops to take her away. But that wasn't an isolated case, and things like that happen nearly every day here. Another thing about the patients is how, I don't want to say bad, but how worse they eventually start to become. While we have so many patients, they all start to blur together, and I do sometimes keep tabs on some of them. And as they progress, they become more plastic-looking almost. They start to resemble those botched plastic surgery stories you see online, and I don't understand how. When they come here at first, they seem flawless, just like Dr. Harrison and Rachel. But slowly they become more and more plastic. And eventually some of them just stop coming. When I asked Dr. Harrison about it, he quickly shrugged it off, telling me he simply forwarded them to a specialist who treats conditions like that. I remain unconvinced, though. Then there was the incident that made me want to tell someone about the strange things going on around here. I'm usually the first to arrive at the office. I have to unlock the door and turn the alarms off. Once that's done, I usually finish off any remaining paperwork from the previous day and start on the paperwork for that day. Normally, right after I come in and turn on the lights and turn off the alarms, Dr. Harrison comes in right after me. But on this day, he was running late, and that's rare for him. He's normally very punctual, and when I saw Rachel had gotten here before him, I started to get a little worried. Mostly about what the patients scheduled for today would do if we had to cancel their appointments. Already I could see the line of them starting outside our doors. When the first phone started ringing, I nervously grabbed it and fully expected it to be another patient arguing with me about an appointment. "Thank you for calling, Dr. Harrison's office. This is Maggie. How can I help you?" I answered with the cookie-cutter opening I always made when someone called the office. To my surprise, it was Dr. Harrison calling me. "Maggie, something came up. Tell Rachel to prepare the first patient immediately after you guys open for me. We're going to need to start it as soon as I arrive, understand?" He asked me, talking so fast I had to focus on what he was saying to understand any of it. "Of course, sir. Are you all right?" I asked him as I stood up from my chair and got ready to talk to Rachel. "I'm fine. Just make sure Rachel sets everything up properly. I'll be there soon." He hung up without even a goodbye, which upset me a little. It was the first time since I started working there that he hadn't said bye to me, but I chalked it up to his rushing and placed the receiver back onto the phone dock. I took a deep breath and stepped back through the reception area and towards the consultation offices where Rachel was probably getting everything ready. I entered the room she was prepping and met her judgmental gaze head on. "Dr. Harrison just called me. He says to prepare the first patient immediately after I open, and that you guys are going to start as soon as he gets here." The look she gave me quickly turned into one of urgency and a little bit of fear. "I told him we should have done that yesterday. This is just great." She grunted, tossing her pen at the floor and walking past me, bumping into my shoulder and stepping away down the hall towards the medical closet. Rubbing my shoulder and sticking my tongue out at her, I walked back over to my desk and finished up my preparations to open. And at 9 o'clock on the dot, I walked over and unlocked the front door for the patients, quickly jumping out of the way so I didn't get trampled by all of them rushing in. Taking my place back at the desk, I sat down and looked up at the first patient who had managed to get to my desk to check in first. "Name, please?" I asked her as I checked my computer to see if she had an appointment. "Kara Smith," she told me. I could tell she was a regular since she acted like I should know her personally and immediately upon seeing her. Little did she know I saw at least 100 people a day. I checked her name and scrolled around on the page before I found her. She was here for a rhinoplasty. I took another look at her and slightly raised my eyebrow. Her nose looked fine to me, but I wasn't exactly allowed to say that to the patients. "Okay, you can go right ahead. Nurse Rachel will be there to meet with you. Dr. Harrison is running a little late today, so I do apologize for that, but he should be here soon," I told her with a smile. She returned my niceties by cussing me out and stomping over toward the door to the consultation rooms where Nurse Rachel was waiting for her. One of the better interactions I've had. I kept checking people in and turning away the people who didn't have appointments. Usually, if they got too rowdy, a little flash of my pepper spray was enough to at least get them to go away. After about an hour of being open and with patients starting to grumble, Dr. Harrison burst through the front doors and quickly ran past everyone, including me. I normally only ever saw him in his doctor coat and scrubs, so seeing him running in with a jacket and a scarf was certainly interesting, especially since it was the middle of summer. He was so well covered up that I almost didn't know it was him. The only thing that told me that it was Dr. Harrison were those beautiful, big green eyes. He quickly made his way towards the consultation rooms and slammed the door shut behind him. I had to stop a few of the patients from trying to follow after him and get them to sit back down in their seats. I took my seat and started answering calls while I occasionally looked out into the waiting room to make sure everyone was behaving themselves. Everything had settled down when a blood-curdling screech came from one of the rooms. I quickly stood up and ran over to the room to make sure everything was okay. "Doctor, Harrison, is everything okay?" I asked as I knocked on the door. To my surprise, the door hadn't properly locked. Dr. Harrison must have been in such a hurry he neglected to have the door closed properly behind him. So when I knocked on it, it swung open slightly to reveal what was going on inside the room. Kara was strapped to a table as Nurse Rachel desperately tried to pin her down to the table, while Dr. Harrison loomed over her with a scalpel. He twisted his head around to look at me, and those shining green eyes almost burned holes into my retinas. "Close the door, Maggie," he ordered me, his normally calm and joyful voice replaced with one of rage and annoyance. I quickly obeyed him and slammed the door shut, my legs trembling as I stood out in the hallway. Because what I also saw on the table was Dr. Harrison slicing a good half of Kara's face off with that scalpel. A surgeon's mask covered his face, and his scrubs were completely drenched in blood. I felt queasy as I walked back to my desk and took my seat. I was shaken up pretty badly, and I tried to convince myself what I'd seen wasn't real. I'd probably just imagined it. It had only been a glance, and there was no way that Dr. Harrison would be doing something so horrible to a patient. After about an hour, Kara came out of the operating room, wrapped up in bandages all over her face, but with a bright smile and thanking Dr. Harrison 1,000 times for his work. He brushed it all aside and handed her a few papers to take over to me. She walked over to me and I looked over the papers and nodded to her. "Everything okay?" I asked her, as I signed off on the papers I needed to sign for her and presented the ones she needed to sign. "Everything is fantastic. Thank you so much for asking. I just know that this nose job will be the one," she said with a smile through the bandages that covered up her nose. I squinted at her to look at where I had sworn her skin had been sliced off, but there wasn't anything there, not even an acne scar. She didn't seem to care about my staring at her. She was focused on signing her papers. With that, she walked away, and the next few patients began to be admitted, while I had to deal with the steady flow of people who continued to enter the waiting room and beg and plead with me to get them an appointment. Around noon, I was packing up and getting ready for lunch when I noticed that on the schedule I would have lunch at the same time as Dr. Harrison. Normally, I'd ask him if he'd wanted something delivered to him, but I figured it was best to leave him be for the time being. As I stood up and got ready, I turned around and found him standing behind me. He scared the absolute hell out of me and made me drop my purse to the ground in shock. He seemed just as surprised and quickly bent over to help me get my purse back up off the floor. "I'm sorry about yelling at you, Maggie," he told me as he handed my purse to me. His face was uncovered from his surgeon mask, and his beautiful face was again exposed to me. I could tell in those big green eyes that he truly meant his apology. "Oh, that's okay, Dr. Harrison. I understand that sometimes you just have a pretty bad day and you can't help but get grumpy. Can I get you anything for lunch while I'm out?" I asked him, happy that we could continue our routine just like normal. The genuine smile he gave me further enforced that we had both forgiven each other. "Just some coffee for now will be fine. Enjoy your lunch, Maggie," he told me with a smile as he turned and returned to the rooms behind the reception area. I shouldered my purse and went to exit the waiting room and out into the parking lot. And as I did, I was quickly shoved to the ground by an unseen force. "What the fuck did he do to me?" Kara's voice screamed at me as she grabbed me up from off of the floor and shook me violently back and forth. It took me a moment to figure out what she was even screaming about, and that was when I saw that her face was starting to peel off. It looked like she had tried to take the bandages off early and a large chunk of skin had followed after it. I don't know, ma'am. I'm just the receptionist." I tried to tell her, but the look in her eyes told me she wasn't going to accept that as an answer. She quickly wrapped her hands around my throat and started squeezing as hard as she could. I gagged and quickly began searching for my pepper spray, only to be horrified to see that my bag had remained on the floor when she had shoved me down to the floor. "Kara, can I please ask you to let my receptionist go?" Dr. Harrison's voice broke through our scuffle, and we both turned to see that he had also just exited the clinic. Upon meeting his gaze, Kara carefully let me go and stood back from me as I quickly ran over to Dr. Harrison. "I'm so sorry, doctor. It's just that I ruined your hard work and I couldn't control myself. She whimpered as she pointed to the chunk of her skin that was hanging off of her cheek. Dr. Harrison looked at me to make sure that I was okay. I nodded at him, and he walked over to Kara to examine her new injury. Because you removed the bandages too quickly. I told you to wait at least 5 days. He tisked as he grabbed the chunk of skin and ripped it right off of her cheek. She didn't even flinch as she just stood there, completely enraptured in him. Go ahead and go back inside. Rachel will see what she can do to fix you. He moved out of her way as she loyally walked towards the clinic. Sir? I asked him, confused and honestly upset that this was happening again. I don't know if I can keep doing this. I was starting to feel like it wasn't safe to be here. He looked over at me with those big green puppy eyes, and I immediately felt bad about wanting to quit. Please don't quit, Maggie. You do so much to make the office better, and I couldn't stand to see you leave. Please, I'll even give you a raise if you stay. He begged, closing the distance between us and taking my hands into his own. It was the first time I'd ever held his hands without him having gloves over them. They were soft and inviting, but I still didn't know if I could stay, although the thought of a raise was very tempting. Can we at least look into getting security, please? I asked him, looking into those shining green eyes. He smiled wide and quickly nodded at me. Of course, I'll look into it right away, and I'll make sure that this never happens again. I swear to you. He was so excited that I was thinking of staying that it melted my heart. He finally let me go and get my lunch, and over some burgers, I figured that I might as well stay. If not for the money, at least to keep seeing him smile like that again. On my return, I dropped off his coffee as he was doing a consultation, and he thanked me as I exited the room. As I walked past another room, I noticed that there was someone in there, which was weird because I had just seen that Rachel had left for lunch as I had arrived. I poked my head into the room and quickly poked my head back out and shut the door behind me. I had just walked into a skinless corpse lying down on the table. Only a few sections of skin remained on it, and it looked almost like a carcass you might find in a butcher shop. I walked back to my desk and immediately shook my head, trying to think of anything else that I might have seen. Maybe it had been one of those anatomical skeletons? I reached over to our lost and found box to see if something in there could cheer me up. I picked up a stress ball and started squeezing it as hard as I could. Not to get off topic, but I'm sure that someone is stealing things from the lost and found box. Whenever I take some sort of inventory of things, I notice a couple of things go missing each time. Anyway, my curiosity got the best of me, and I stood up from my desk again and walked back to that room. I stared at the door for a moment and reached a shaky hand out to the knob and turned it to open. And to my surprise, shock, and confusion, the room was completely empty. I pushed the door open completely and entered the room to try and find any evidence that anyone had even been here to begin with. That was when I was tackled to the ground from behind and pinned to the floor. I let out a scream and thrashed about in complete shock and horror. I turned my head to try and see who was attacking me, and I started screaming louder when I saw that it was the skinless Kara. "What have you done to me?" she screamed at me, which got me to scream even louder at her bleeding and skinless body. She flipped me over with a loud grunt and wrapped her hands around my throat and began to squeeze my throat shut. I gagged and reached out to try and stop her, pushing on her soft, squishy form and finding that because she was coated in blood, she'd become slick to the touch. Just when I'd thought that I was going to die on the floor like this, I heard 2 pairs of footsteps running in and tackle Kara to the ground. I panted and struggled to breathe, and as my vision readjusted itself, I was thankful and surprised to see Dr. Harrison's beautiful face staring back at me. "Are you all right, Maggie?" he asked me with genuine concern in his voice. His soft voice filled my head, and as I stared into his glowing green eyes, I swear that an immediate sense of relief and pleasure filled my body. I'm a light, sir," I told him, sitting up from the floor and croaking out my words as my throat burnt like all hell. He quickly examined me and deemed that everything was okay. He next turned to the thrashing, skinless body that Rachel was busy keeping face down on the floor. "Maggie, please leave this to us. Just keep the waiting room civil while Rachel and I deal with this," Dr. Harrison told me, his eyes glowing again, and I could have sworn that I saw swirls in his pupils. I carefully nodded and exited the room. Quickly, I ran to the bathroom and vomited up everything I'd eaten that day. The moment I broke eye contact with Dr. Harrison, everything came flooding back at once, and I had a full-blown panic attack in the bathroom. It took me a moment to compose myself before I returned to the front desk. Don't get me wrong, I know all the weird shit happening here isn't normal, and it does scare the shit out of me, but Dr. Harrison did give me a raise. A big one, and soon we are going to get security to help me out with the more outlandish patients, so I can hopefully just ignore the stranger things that happen here. Right? The next time I came into work after the situation with Dr. Harrison and Kara, I thought about whether I should accept the pay raise and continue working at the office. I unlocked the front door and entered the waiting room, still working things out in my mind when I slammed right into a person. I sputtered backward and looked up in confusion and horror since I was supposed to be the only one allowed in this early at the clinic. "You must be Maggie," a cheery voice told me as he moved past me and turned off the alarm before it began blaring. I clutched my heart at the shock this stranger had just given me. The fact that he knew me, but I didn't know who he was, made it worse. Who are you?" I blurted out after my heart nearly split my sternum and leapt out of my chest. He flicked on the lights and the waiting room was fully lit up, revealing the person who had startled me so badly. To my surprise, he seemed normal. I know that's weird to say, but he seemed just so average. Average height, build, everything. His hair was combed nicely and he had a big smile on his face. "I'm Wilson, your new security guard." He waved at me happily. I let my jaw drop a little at that. Not to throw shade at Wilson, because he's such an absolute sweetheart, but he does not strike me as any kind of security guard. The only thing he had on that showed him to be a security guard was the vest that said security on it that he wears. I was also shocked that he had been hired so quickly. It had taken less than 2 days for Dr. Harrison to hire him. How long have you been here?" I asked him, as I started to calm down and walked over to my reception desk. I was always the first one here, and I usually arrive pretty early in the morning, so to be beaten here was an absolute shock to me. "Oh, I just arrived a couple of minutes ago, actually. Sorry for locking the door. I had orders from Dr. Harrison to lock it after I entered," he told me as he followed me over to my desk. That made sense to me. If he was going to be our security, it made sense for him to arrive first now. As I started getting my things ready, I watched as Wilson took his post by the front door. He stood so still I swore he would make a perfect king's guard. I slowly got to work on some paperwork as I waited for the hours to tick down to when Dr. Harrison and Rachel would arrive. Rachel was the first of the duo to arrive, rushing past the line of people who were already queuing for their appointments. She mumbled to herself as she dusted herself off and looked over at Wilson, without even getting a slight startle from him. "Hey, fatty," she called out to me as she walked up to my desk. I didn't even bat an eye at her as I flipped through the final few sheets of paperwork that I had. When she noticed that I wasn't paying any attention to her, she walked up to me and slapped her hands down on the desk to get my attention. "Oh, Rachel, I didn't hear you come in," I told her with a smile. The pissed-off look on her face was the most rewarding sensation I can get. "How can I help you, sweetie?" I asked her with a smile, sliding a bowl of candy close to her to tempt her. She looked at it with disgust and at me with even more. "Keep an eye on Wilson. If he starts doing anything weird, hand him off to Dr. Harrison. Understand? Get that through your thick, Twinkie-filled skull?" She tapped my forehead for emphasis. I swatted her hand away and nodded at her. I chanced a peep over at Wilson and noticed that he was looking at the two of us. I smiled and waved at him, and he did the same. "I'll be sure to keep you informed, Rachel. Oh, by the way, when did you want me to schedule that operation for you?" I asked her, pulling some papers from underneath my desk. She looked at me with confusion. "What operation?" she asked, to which I smiled devilishly. "The one to get that stick out of your ass," I said with a little giggle. She tisked in anger and stormed off to get ready for the day's surgery, leaving me to giggle and continue with my paperwork. About half an hour later, Dr. Harrison arrived, also being hounded by the waiting patients. He sighed and looked over at Wilson with a smile and tousled his hair like an approving father. "Hello, Dr. Harrison." I waved at him as he approached. He flashed me a perfect, toothy grin and came up to the desk. "You've got another busy day ahead of you, huh?" I asked him as I handed him a stack of papers and clipboards. He took one look at them and sighed as he took his glasses off and rubbed his eyes. "It's never ending," he said with a sigh, as he accepted the giant stack of forms and clipboards from me. He glanced over towards Wilson and then back at me. "Rachel told you to keep an eye on him, correct?" he asked me as he struggled with his mountain of paperwork. "Mm-hmm," I told him, just adding to the pile like a giant Jenga tower. "I'll be sure to inform you, sir," I told him, as I finally finished giving him everything. He sighed and looked back over at Wilson. "Wilson, help me carry this shit," he ordered the security guard. He nodded quickly and walked over, taking half the stack of papers from him and helping him carry them to the back operating rooms and consultation rooms. After Wilson returned, I nodded at him, and he opened the floodgates to allow everyone in. I braced myself for a long day as I started listening to what the patients wanted and what they needed. "What do you mean in 6 months? I need the surgery now. Can't you fucking see that, you fucking cow?" a woman screamed at me, tapping her manicured fingers on her clipboard for emphasis. I watched her and waited for her to finish so I could explain it to her. "Ma'am, Dr. Harrison is completely booked for the next 6 months. Now, if someone cancels, there may be an opening, but for the foreseeable future, I can only get you an appointment in 6 months." I told her again, but she just completely refused to listen to me. "Get rid of someone's appointment then. How is it that these ugly fuckers can get ahead of me?" she screamed at me, getting some spit on my face. "Because they made an appointment before you, ma'am," I told her, struggling to keep my composure. "Once again, I can schedule you for a visit in 6 months, or you can wait and have it take even longer." I pulled out the application for her, and when I looked back at her, she was lunging at me to strangle me. She grabbed me by the throat and was about to start squeezing when she was suddenly yanked away from me. I coughed in surprise and looked over to see that Wilson had grabbed the lady and was effortlessly dragging her away and toward the entrance. She was screaming and kicking and throwing every kind of obscenity my way. Wilson leaned down and grabbed her by the hair and by her clothes and tossed her out like they do in cartoons. I was stunned at how strong he was, and what he had done to that woman seemed to calm the other patients down as they came back up to me to continue with their paperwork and questions. At around noon, I leaned back and gave myself a good stretch that popped a few joints and fixed my back. It was almost my lunchtime, and I looked over to see how much longer it would be. As I did, I heard something skitter away, and the lost and found box tipped over. I rolled my chair over towards it in complete confusion and saw that a few more items were missing. "What the hell?" I wondered aloud, before picking and placing things back into the box. I rolled back over to my desk and decided to keep more of an eye on the box. When I turned back out to look at the lobby, I was shocked to see Wilson staring silently at me. "Is something wrong?" he asked me after I had jumped a foot out of my chair in surprise at seeing him standing there. No, everything is okay. Thank you, Wilson. And thank you for dealing with that woman." He smiled at me and nodded before going back over to his post. At this point, most of the patients had been dealt with, and I was doing some more paperwork. Mostly just filling in a few items and signing off on some things. "Hey, Maggie, it's your lunchtime," Dr. Harrison said as he stuck his head into my reception area. I looked over at him and smiled in excitement, standing up from my chair and stretching some more again. "Can I get you anything while I'm gone, sir?" I asked him. He looked over at the old antique phone mounted on the wall, still waiting for it to ring but with no luck. He sighed and pulled down his surgical mask before shaking his head. "Just the usual coffee is fine. How is Wilson? Anything strange?" he asked me as he entered the reception area completely and pulled off his surgical gloves. I looked back over at our silent guardian. "Well, there was a woman who tried to choke me out. He grabbed her and tossed her out," I told him, mimicking how Wilson had thrown the woman out of the waiting room. Dr. Harrison looked over at Wilson for a moment and then nodded. "All right. Well, I'll have him watch your desk while you're out." I nodded as I grabbed my purse and phone. "Oh, one more thing. Has Rachel been making fun of you?" he asked me, which got my attention and stopped me from finishing my packing up. Rachel had always made fun of me for my weight, but like I've said before, I've always been comfortable with who I am, so I've never allowed her words to get to me. "Sometimes, but it's nothing I can't handle, sir," I said with a smile. He looked at me and slowly nodded his head. Those gorgeous green eyes glimmered in the light of my office. Anytime I look too long at them, I feel almost lightheaded, so I pulled my eyes away and finished packing up. I'll be going now, sir. I'll be back with your coffee. Right, see you soon, Maggie, he said, slipping back into the hallways behind my office. I walked out into the waiting room and walked up to Wilson. I'm off to lunch, I told him, and he nodded with a smile as well. I exited the clinic and headed to a nearby sandwich shop to get a bite to eat. After I'd eaten my sandwich, I stopped at the coffee shop that me and Dr. Harrison both enjoy before making my way back to the clinic. I was walking through the parking lot when I saw a horde of people running and screaming out of the clinic. At first, I was worried that a fire had broken out or something, so I quickly ran closer to get a sense of what was happening. The people were all screaming in absolute terror, and this didn't seem to be a scream of the fire. These were screams of complete terror. Against my better judgment, I rushed in past the scores of screaming people, doing my best to keep my 2 coffees above everyone's heads. When I finally made it into the lobby, I could see why everyone had been running and screaming for their lives. Limbs and chunks of flesh were thrown in every direction. Some people were crawling away with only a few limbs still attached and screaming their lungs out. I looked over towards my desk and saw that Wilson was standing behind it, but he looked much different. His body was melting, not just his face, but he looked like a wax sculpture melting in the summer heat. He looked over at me and I watched in disgust as one of his eyes slowly began to melt out of its socket. "Oh, fuck that," I declared and quickly turned around to leave. That was before something grabbed me by the leg and stopped me from running, yanking me backward into the waiting room again. I looked down at the floor and saw one of the arms on the floor was still moving somehow. I stared at it in horror, but before I could process it, the severed arm began pointing towards my office again. I looked over and saw that the Wilson blob was no longer looking at me. He seemed to be transfixed on something. I looked down at the arm again and groaned a little as I started stepping through the bloody mess that the waiting room had become. As carefully as I could, I started walking toward the doors that separate the waiting room from the ORs and the consultation rooms. I carefully opened the door and entered the hallways and was surprised to see both Dr. Harrison and Rachel standing nearby. Dr. Harrison's gaze trained fully on the Wilson blob, and Rachel motioning for me to enter the closest consultation room with her. I quickly ran over, and once I was in, Dr. Harrison followed after me and slammed the door behind him. "Way to go, fat ass. You were supposed to warn Dr. Harrison if that idiot started acting weird," Rachel hissed at me. I could tell she wanted to smack the shit out of me, but with Dr. Harrison here, she couldn't. "He was fine when I left. What the hell is going on here?" I demanded to know, suddenly realizing that I still had the coffees that Dr. Harrison and I were going to drink. "Quit, both of you!" Dr. Harrison screamed, rubbing his eyes and walking past the two of us and looking at himself in the mirror. He sighed and pulled out a bottle of eye drops and began to squeeze a few drops into his eyes. "This is my fault. I got too focused on the surgery that I let my hold on Wilson slip." He sighed, rubbing his eyes and blinking rapidly once the drops had settled. "What do we do now, sir?" I asked him, still confused but in a life-and-death situation. "You don't have any time to contemplate shit." I carefully handed him his hot coffee, and he looked at it and then up at me, sighing before taking it from me and opening the lid to blow on it. "Well, we have liquid nitrogen in one of the ORs. One of the operations today was a mole removal, so we have it prepped. Maybe we can freeze him partially." He wondered aloud to himself, starting to sip at his coffee and wincing at how hot it was. "With all due respect, sir, I don't think he's quite melted enough to ensure a thorough freeze. Couldn't we simply turn the heater on and melt him, then freeze him afterward?" Rachel asked, which seemed like a good idea to me. "Rachel, I don't think I need to tell you why that's a horrible fucking idea," Dr. Harrison hissed as he stared at Rachel with absolute disdain in his eyes and face. Rachel seemed to realize her mistake and quickly shirked away from Dr. Harrison's intense gaze. I didn't understand why it was a horrible idea, but I didn't want to pry. The three of us stood there trying to think of a way to escape. I took a sip of my iced coffee before looking over at Dr. Harrison's coffee, which was still scalding hot. I carefully set mine down and walked up to him and took it from him. "What? Suddenly liking hot coffee?" he asked, a bit confused. I smiled and shook my head at him. "Why not just throw this at Wilson?" I pointed at the coffee. Dr. Harrison looked at me and then slowly began to nod. He turned to Rachel and ordered her to follow me out into the hall while he went to get the tank of liquid nitrogen. We opened the door to the hallway, and Rachel and I went out to look for Wilson. It was pretty easy to find him since he had left a gross wet trail right to him. He was in the lobby eating several body parts and was seemingly paying us no attention. "Okay, you distract him. I'll throw it on him," I told Rachel. She looked at me like I was crazy. "Just throw it at him. He's already distracted, you idiot," she hissed, which got me to pout at her. "You're no fun," I huffed before starting to sneak over towards the Wilson blob. As he was eating, I stepped up behind him and quickly tossed the scalding cup of coffee on him. His skin boiled and sizzled, and he screamed out in pain. A decent portion of it had landed on his face, and the already melting skin began to slosh off of him in great wet chunks. "Out of the way, Maggie!" Dr. Harrison shouted, walking past me with a bucket in his hands. I quickly ran behind him, and with a quick flick, he threw the whole bucket at Wilson. His body began to steam and hiss as the two clashing temperatures on him collided. The liquid nitrogen began to take effect, and Wilson began to freeze in place, and in a few moments he was frozen solid. "Thank God that's over," Rachel sighed, walking over to us. Dr. Harrison, however, didn't look too happy about this. He looked terrified. I looked around the waiting room and stared at the gore that had happened. And before I could even think about what I was doing, I leaned over and threw up on Rachel's shoes. She said every swear in the book as she stepped away from me. I apologized half-heartedly and noticed that Dr. Harrison was gone. I looked around for him and noticed his trail in the Wilson goop, and Gore led back to the reception desk. I poked my head in and noticed that he was using that old phone, and that he looked like a wound-up ball of anxiety. He was tapping his foot and biting his nails as he was waiting for the phone to connect. "Hello, sir." "Yes. Yes, I know." "Yes, I'm aware, Mr. Sinclair," Dr. Harrison nodded over and over again. I had never seen him so submissive before. It was like he was being scolded by his father. "Well, something happened and I need your help to clean it up." "Yes, quite a few, actually." "I'm sorry, sir. I thought I could handle it." He winced afterward. "You barf on my shoes and now you're eavesdropping on our boss?" Rachel asked me, startling me and getting a yelp out of me. Dr. Harrison looked over at us and turned his back to us, starting to talk quieter so we couldn't hear him. "You can go home. We're going to be closed for a while," Rachel told me, before walking away down the hall towards the ORs. I watched her and sighed as I picked up the few items I had at my desk that weren't covered in Wilson goop. "I appreciate that, sir. Thank you. I'll make it up to you." Dr. Harrison sighed and hung up the antique phone, walking back into the hallway without telling me goodbye. The first time that's ever happened. I wasn't called back into work until the end of the week, and when I entered the lobby, I was shocked to see Wilson standing at his post with that same happy smile as before. He turned into a melted version of himself. Not only that, but the waiting room was completely spotless and looked cleaner than it had ever been. "Morning, Maggie. I'm so sorry about what happened last time. I promise it won't happen again," he told me, to which I could only nod and walk past him towards my desk. I gripped my can of pepper spray close until Dr. Harrison came into work. I quickly stood up and ran over toward him. "What's he doing back?" I asked, completely stunned that he had allowed Wilson back in any form or shape. "I had him fixed. He should work much better now." Dr. Harrison sighed, and I could tell he was still upset over what had happened. He looked at me with those beautiful green eyes, and I saw for the first time since meeting him, pain and sadness behind them. "I'm so sorry this happened, Maggie. I wanted to make you feel safer, and I fucked it up." He sighed and rubbed his messy brown hair. "It's all right, sir. I still have a lot of questions, but I'm just glad that you're okay. And if you say that Wilson is better now, I can accept him." I looked over at Wilson and gave him an awkward smile and wave. He waved back. "I appreciate that, Maggie," he said with a small smile. He patted me on the head and walked past me to start his day. I walked back over to my desk and finished preparing for my shift. I've been keeping a close eye on Wilson, and for the most part, he hasn't shown any signs of melting into a horrible monster. Sometimes I notice that his face looks a little lopsided, but after I tell Dr. Harrison, it's usually a quick fix. What surprised me most about the incident was that nobody reported it. Nobody so much as talked about it besides the three of us. I'm in a dilemma of being paid very well and now being safely guarded at my work, and yet there's still this nagging feeling in the back of my mind that something horrible is just lurking below the surface, And that also something keeps stealing from the lost and found. Having Wilson with us stopped more of the patients from trying to kill me every time they didn't get what they wanted. But I felt as if I was constantly walking on eggshells around him. He's so cheery and friendly towards me and Rachel that I sometimes forget about what he is. But sometimes when it gets a little too hot in the office, I notice that he starts to melt a bit. It was my idea to keep the waiting room at a cool 50 degrees to stop him from melting. The patients might complain a bit, but honestly, as long as it keeps Wilson from turning into a goop monster again, I'm all for it. I came into work the other day dressed in a cozy sweater so that I didn't catch a cold in our freezing waiting room. I smiled and waved at Wilson when I opened the door to the waiting room and saw him standing dutifully at his post. His cheer is infectious at times, and I can't help but smile back at him. He doesn't seem ever to leave the waiting room, so I have to imagine that he just stands at his post the entire night. Props to him for his dedication. Sitting down at my desk, I noticed that I had much less paperwork than normal. Pulling up the schedule for today, I was surprised to see that only 4 patients were planned for today. I've worked here for almost an entire year, and I've never seen Dr. Harrison have less than 15 patients minimum. My first assumption was that it must have been some sort of mistake, and that maybe my calendar was wrong. "Hey, lard ass." I turned over to see Rachel standing at my desk with her arms crossed and her usual bitchy expression staring at me. "Anything wrong with Wilson today?" she asked me as she tapped her finger impatiently against her arm. I looked over at Wilson, who had heard his name, and was looking back over at us. "Besides never leaving that post? Nah, he's fine." I told her. I wanted to talk shit to her, but my curiosity took precedence over my pettiness. "Why does Dr. Harrison only have 4 patients today?" I asked her. She looked at me with surprise, and then I showed her the schedule for today. "Oh, that's today?" she asked as she yanked the sheet of paper away from me to examine it. "It's nothing you should concern yourself with. These are just real important patients that need his full attention." She tossed the schedule back at me and walked away, leaving me in a huff and with an itch of curiosity. So I decided to wait for him. It was another rare moment of him being late again, so I was worried something had happened to him. Dr. Harrison arrived close to opening time, and it was obvious to me that he wasn't holding up so well. Ever since having to call whoever that old rotary phone was connected to, he had been in a deep depression. He approached my desk and gave me a half-hearted smile, but I could tell that he was still upset. The look in his eyes was enough to show me that his beautiful green eyes didn't have the shine that they once had. "Hey, Doc, can I get you anything to cheer you up?" I asked him, worried that he might mess up a surgery in his current state. He looked at me and shook his head before staring down at the schedule laid before him. "That's today, huh?" He sighed and pushed his glasses up to rub the bridge of his nose. "Do me a favor, Maggie," he started telling me, placing his glasses back into place. "The 3rd patient that's going to show up today, do your best not to interact with him too much. He can be a little much." He told me, grabbing the papers I handed him and making his way back into the back hallways toward the ORs and consultation rooms. I let out a sigh as I started working on my few pieces of paperwork. When the doors opened, I was surprised to see that a flood of patients didn't come rushing in as they normally did. I looked over at Wilson to see if he was as confused as I was, but the blank look on his face with a smile on his face proved to me that he probably wasn't thinking about much. I wheeled my chair over to the computer and decided to check something. A quick search showed me why there wasn't anybody showing up today. Our clinic showed up as closed. It was probably the easiest day of work I've had since I started working here. To the point that I was even able to start reading a book I had brought on my first day of work, thinking that I would actually have time to read it. Of course, though, the moment I turned the first page, the front door opened, and I heard long heels clicking against our floors. I let out an annoyed exhale as I looked up from my book and quickly dropped it to the floor. In all my time working here, I've seen some people who are clearly addicted to plastic surgery, the kind that you immediately think of when you think of the phrase botched surgery. But this woman was the poster child of botched surgery. Her skin was pulled tight against her skull and was so thin that I thought any little cut to her skin would cause it to snap off her skull. Not to mention she looked like her face was made completely of plastic. "I have arrived," she said, with all the superiority that someone like she imagined herself to have. Oh God, has Dr. Harrison gotten desperate enough to hire pigs as his receptionist? She scoffed when she laid eyes on me. I had to physically bite my tongue to stop myself from saying anything to her back. Hello, ma'am. Dr. Harrison should be all ready for you, so you can go right ahead, I told her in my best customer service voice, all the while scratching at my hand to stop it from wanting to punch her right in her stupid plastic face. She snuffed and walked toward the door that led to the rooms. Once she had finally left my sight and I heard the clicking of her heels retreat into one of the nearby rooms, I let out a long and annoyed sigh and picked my book up from the floor. It immediately returned to the floor when I looked up and saw yet another patient waiting for me. He was just as plastic-looking as the woman was. Lucky for me, he wasn't as big of an asshole as the woman had been. In fact, he was perfectly silent. You can go right ahead, sir. Dr. Harrison should be with you shortly, I told him. He nodded at me and started walking. It seemed like he could barely move his body. It looked like he was a living action figure with how he was moving. I watched him and shook my head, starting to question why I had decided to stay here. I gave up on reading the book and instead decided to just double-check all the paperwork I had done that day, which took only a few minutes, and I found myself missing the endless rush of patients. Of course not the crazies, but for them, I had Wilson standing nearby. This time I was able to see the next patient enter the waiting room. He wasn't like the previous two who had dressed like they were about to have a photo shoot afterward. He was dressed in a dirty hoodie and sweatpants, a face mask covering the lower part of his face, and his hands were planted firmly in his hoodie pockets. He approached the desk and stared at me with cold brown eyes that just seemed hollow, like there was no life behind them at all. I thought for a moment that maybe he was some junkie who was planning to rob the clinic or something, but with Wilson close at hand, I held off any accusations. Hello, sir. Do you have an appointment today? I asked him, mostly for verification. He stared at me with those hollow eyes, and I began to get uncomfortable with just how intently he was staring at me. I reached under my desk to get my pepper spray, but as I did, he cleared his throat. Yay, it's under Spencer, he told me. Even his voice gave me uncanny feelings. It sounded like the recording of a voice. I wondered if that was his last name or first. I looked over at my monitor and was surprised to see an appointment just under the name Spencer. That was it. I clicked on his name to see if he had insurance or anything at all like that. There was nothing under his name, just his name, and that he had an appointment at this time. Yeah, I said as I took a look at him. While he was wearing a hoodie, his hood wasn't up, and he had a tangled mass of brown hair on his head. I drummed my fingers on the table as I kept looking at his sparse records. Should I just let him through, I thought to myself. I decided I needed confirmation before I was going to allow him into the clinic. Can you just have a seat? I just need to have a quick word with Dr. Harrison. It shouldn't take more than a few minutes, I said, giving him the best fake smile I could. He stared at me for a couple of seconds before looking over at the row of seats available to him. Don't take too long, he told me as he turned and walked over to a nearby seat. I nodded at him and quickly stood up from my chair and glanced over at Wilson. He had his eyes securely trained on Spencer, and I was assured enough to go and ask Dr. Harrison. Walking over to the first OR room, I didn't hear any sounds coming from inside, so I knocked before just barging in unannounced. Dr. Harrison, I need to ask you something. I told him through the door as I backed up enough to let the door swing open. It took a few moments. Enough time elapsed to where I thought he hadn't heard me. But just as I was about to knock again, the door slowly opened and Rachel stuck her head out. What do you want, fat ass? We're in the middle of surgery. She scolded me from behind her face mask. I sighed and brushed past her annoying comment. That Spencer guy is here, and I wanted to know if I should admit him. He seems really sketchy, I told her, glancing back toward my desk just to make sure he wasn't spying on me or anything. Rachel rolled her eyes at me and pulled her mask down. That's what you're interrupting us for? Yes, let that asshole in, and don't let him touch any of the equipment. Before I could ask any other follow-up question, the door was slammed in my face. Dumb bitch, I hissed at her and turned to return to my desk. I took a quick seat and made sure that Wilson hadn't torn Spencer to shreds. Seeing that he was still sitting where he was, I motioned for him to come up to the desk. Hands still in his hoodie pocket, he stood up from his seat and walked over to me. You can go right ahead, sir. Dr. Harrison did ask for you not to touch any of our equipment. I told him, ignoring the fact that Rachel had told me that. Yeah. As long as he fixes me, Spencer said as he walked over to the door and entered into the hallway towards the OR. Leaning back in my chair, I looked over at the clock and groaned when I realized that only an hour and a half had passed since we opened. Just as I was about to try reading that book again, I heard a loud snap coming from the lost and found box. Gotcha! I shouted triumphantly as I quickly wheeled over to inspect the mousetrap I had left inside the lost and found. I figured that maybe a rat or mouse had been getting into the box and stealing things to make a nest or something out of it. I peeked into the box and was immediately surprised to see that nothing had been caught. The trap hadn't gone off accidentally, though, as the cheese I had used as bait had been stolen. Smart mouse, I hissed, making a mental note to get more traps on my way home from work. As I was contemplating ways to catch this mystery creature that was stealing from the lost and found a loud screech ripped through the entire clinic, followed quickly afterward by Rachel screaming. Standing up quickly from my chair, I looked over at Wilson, who had also looked on in confusion over what was going on. He quickly left his post and entered the door towards the hallway. I followed after him, making my way to the back of the receptionist area that led into the same hallway. Wilson was trying to enter the OR where Dr. Harrison and Rachel were, but the door was locked. He looked slightly confused, like he'd never come across a situation like this before. Before he could figure out how to open the door, it flew off its hinges and set him flying into the wall. A sickening crunch and splat sounded out as Wilson was splattered against the wall like a mosquito. Quickly afterward, Rachel came sprinting out of the room and towards me, not even insulting me as she grabbed me by the arm and started running with me in tow. This so took me aback that I didn't even know what we were running from. But I heard loud screeching behind us, and I ventured a look behind us to see what it was, and was immediately regretful that I did. Chasing after us was the upper torso of the woman. Her spinal cord had turned into a long tail, and her ribs were serving as legs propelling her, along with her elongated arms. "What the fuck is that?" I screamed at Rachel as we rushed into the nearby OR room and quickly slammed the door behind us. We both pressed ourselves against the door to stop the monster from getting through the door. It slammed itself against the door and broke the top hinge, but failed to bust down the door. After a few more attempts, the monster screeched at us, and we heard it drag itself across the floor toward the nearby rooms. "Thank God your FATAS was actually useful in this situation," Rachel said through haggard breaths. She looked at me just in time for me to slap her across the face as hard as I physically could. I slapped her so hard I knocked her head into the door and dazed her something fierce. "Shut up, you dumb bitch! What the fuck was that thing?" I demanded to know from her, grabbing her by the collar of her scrubs and shaking her back and forth. "Quit calling me names and answer me, you dumb cuh!" Before I could further swear at her, someone in the room cleared his throat and pulled both of our attentions to him. "Can you guys take this somewhere else?" Spencer asked us as he smacked a pack of cigarettes against his gloved hands. He had surgical gloves over his hands, and I recognized them as the ones we had at the office. "You can't smoke in here," I told him, tossing Rachel away like she was a sack of potatoes, and looking over at Spencer as he laughed at me. "One, this is a doctor's office, and two, smoking is bad for you." I was in total mom mode since I hate people who smoke. It's a nasty, gross habit, and it's probably the biggest waste of money I can think of. Tangent aside, Spencer continued to laugh at me. "Lady, at this point in my life, smoking is the least horrible thing I've done to myself." He reached his hand up to pull down his facial mask, and I was horrified to see that the lower half of his face was completely skeletal. His nose was gone and replaced with the holes where it should have been. He flicked the box of cigarettes up and got one to stick out of the box. He leaned down and placed it between his teeth before he fished out a lighter from his pocket. "You lost more skin, you freak?" Rachel asked as she walked over, blood streaming from her forehead from where she'd landed after my smack had slammed her head against the door. "Doctor, Harrison told you to stop testing on yourself," she scolded, before looking over at me and skinging in anger at the fact I had fought back against her. "I don't remember him telling me that. All I remember is him saying that I should stop testing on myself. Not that I have to." Spencer chuckled as he lit his cigarette and began to take a deep drag of it. The smoke billowed from his jaw and his missing nose. Too grossed out to keep looking at him, I turned away and stared at Rachel. "What the fuck was that thing?" I asked her again. She looked over at me and rolled her eyes. Either you tell me or I'm smacking you again, I warned her, and judging by her reaction, she wasn't too keen on that option. That's the patient. Something went wrong, and Dr. Harrison lost control of her. And well, she turned into that thing. She sighed as she crossed her arms at me. She whipped Dr. Harrison with her tail and knocked him out cold. How the hell does she turn into that after a simple surgery? I asked her, Spencer letting out another laugh, clearly enjoying all this. This wasn't a simple surgery. The three patients besides this jackass, she motioned at Spencer, who waved at the two of us, are meant to provide Dr. Harrison with more skin and in turn get their skin replaced with silicone and plastic. He's done this hundreds of times, and this is the first time something like this has happened, Ace told me, walking over to the medical cabinet in the room and opening it with her key. Why would Dr. Harrison need skin for? I asked her. Spencer let out some more chuckles as smoke poured out of the crevasses in his exposed skull. Rachel ignored my question as she pulled out a few vials of morphine and placed them on the counter just under the medical cabinet. For me? You shouldn't have, Rachel, Spencer said with fake surprise. It was then that I noticed that even without opening and closing his mouth, he was able to talk at the same volume and with the same clarity as if he wasn't smoking a cigarette. It's not for you, jackass. It's to sedate that thing outside, she said, quickly checking the cabinets for any syringes. But she quickly came up empty. The entire room had been completely cleaned of syringes. Give them back, she ordered. I thought she was talking about me, but then her accusatory gaze turned to Spencer, who was staring up at the ceiling. You gotta fix that light bulb, he said as Rachel walked over and grabbed him by the hoodie strings. Almost as quickly as she did, however, Spencer pulled a gun out and pointed it straight at Rachel's forehead. Don't touch me, he ordered, and Rachel quickly let him go. You had a gun the whole time? I asked him incredulously, which quickly turned to fear as he turned the gun on me. Well, who are you? Me and Dr. Harrison have an understanding. He stops my skin from falling off any further, and I keep him well supplied with whatever medications he needs to run the clinic. Simple business. He took one last full puff of the cigarette and allowed it to drop to the floor, crushing it under his foot. He can't fix your skin if he's dead, idiot, Rachel told him, still insulting the man who had a gun trained on her. He looked over to her and then back at me before letting out an annoyed sigh. He lowered his gun and reached into his pockets, pulling out a couple of syringes. How deep are those pockets? I asked him. He looked over at me, and I could just tell that if he had the ability to smile, he would have been. Wouldn't you like to know? He snorted as he handed the syringes to Rachel. Just dope that thing up and I'll finish her off with this. He reached back into his pockets and pulled out a syringe filled with what looked like blue glow stick fluid. Don't ask what it is, 'cause I'm not answering that. He told me before I could even get the thought into my head. Rachel picked up the vials of morphine and started filling a couple of the syringes with it. She walked over to me, and I half expected her to stick me with one of the needles, but instead, she handed me one. Don't make me regret this, she said, walking over to the door and cracking it open slightly. Spencer joined us at the door as he pulled his face mask back on and joined us out in the hallway. It wasn't too hard to find the creature since she was currently busy eating the second patient who had arrived today. What's the plan? I whispered, watching as the monster chowed down on the poor man. He was a mangled heap of meat and plastic by the look of things. What was more horrifying was the fact that the creature was using his arms. Somehow it had just ripped them off from the joint and had placed them just below her own arms. Before I could take even more in of the monster, my ears began ringing with pain. I looked over at Spencer and my eyes went wide when I saw that he had simply pulled his gun out and shot the creature. That ought to do it, Spencer said as he waited for the creature. It screeched at the three of us and left its meal alone before pouncing towards us. Just as it was about to pounce on us and most likely rip us to shreds, something slammed us out of the way. I landed on top of Rachel and Spencer landed next to me. I looked over and was delighted to see that Wilson was holding the thrashing and screaming monster. He looked a little worse for wear, sort of like a melted wax statue, but he still had all that strength. Rachel mumbled and screamed from under me, and I climbed off of her. I could tell that she just wanted to yell at me, but she let it slide for now. We didn't even need to use the morphine, as Wilson finally managed to hold the monster still. Spencer simply walked up to the creature and plunged his syringe of glowing blue liquid into the monster. As soon as he walked away from it, it calmed down almost immediately. And then shortly after, it began to dissolve and melt into a steaming pile of bones, guts, and God knows what. All of that was too much for me, and it made me throw up on Rachel's shoes again. "God damn it, not again," she screamed. Before the two of us could start fighting each other again, Spencer loudly cleared his throat to pull our attention over to him. "You should probably check on the doc. I'll be in my operating room if you need me," he told us as he walked past us. As he did, he reached down and picked up the syringes of morphine that Rachel had dropped when I had thrown up on her shoes. Wordlessly, he plucked the syringe from me and walked away toward his room. I was blown away by just how calm the skeletal man was about this entire situation. I was just barely able to wrap my head around all this. But we quickly went to check on Dr. Harrison. Lucky for him, the monster didn't seem to show much attention to him, and we found him unconscious lying against the wall where the creature had tossed him. I wanted to help, but Rachel took one look at him and quickly shooed me away. She ordered me to man the front desk and, more importantly, call the person on the other end of the rotary phone and request his assistance. I was about to bitch at her, but I could tell that she didn't need my help. So I made myself useful and returned to my desk. I didn't exactly have a number for the person, so I scratched my head, trying to figure out how to call the person. "Just tap on it," Spencer told me as he leaned against the entrance of my reception area. I looked over at him in confusion. In my mind, I was thinking I was going to have to tap it on the side or something. He noticed I was struggling with his instructions. He sighed in annoyance and showed me how to do it. He lifted the receiver from the phone and tapped on the cradle that had been holding it. I mentally slapped my forehead and walked over to take the phone from him. The phone rang for a few seconds before I heard a click, followed by crackling. I thought that it was going to be like talking through a tin can, but the voice that came through on the phone was loud and clear. "James, what is it? Don't tell me Spencer is getting into trouble again." The voice on the other end of the phone sounded incredibly posh, like someone out of an old movie from the 30s. It took me a moment to even figure out what to tell him. Hello, sir. This is Maggie, his receptionist. I need your help," I told him. He didn't say anything for a few seconds. He wasn't expecting my voice to be on the other side of the phone. I could hear a loud, long sigh from him, and I could just tell he was rubbing his eyes. "What happened this time?" he asked, his posh voice clearly annoyed by this. I did my best to get him up to speed. He didn't say much, but did ask me a few questions for clarification. He told me that he would handle all of it, and that I was to tell James, Dr. Harrison, that he should expect a visit from him soon. And with that, he hung up on me. I relayed this information to Rachel. She had laid Dr. Harrison down on an operation table and was tending to him. "He isn't going to take the news well," she sighed, rubbing her eyes and looking back at me. "You should probably actually close the clinic for today. This whole thing has gone tits up." She sighed, shooing me away and going back to take care of Dr. Harrison. About an hour later, I was getting ready to leave when I heard Rachel talking with someone. I assumed that Dr. Harrison was awake now. I walked to the entrance of the hallway and did my best to listen, but their voices were too muffled and I couldn't make anything out. Rachel left the room and walked past me to check up on Spencer. I took this opportunity to walk over to check on Dr. Harrison. I carefully opened the door and poked my head into the room. Dr. Harrison had his face in his hands and was upset over everything. I was about to fully enter the room when suddenly he started laughing. Slowly at first, but it picked up in intensity. He walked over to the mirror in the room and stared at himself. His laughter picked up as he reached up to grab his face. I saw from his reflection that a piece of his skin was hanging off from the bridge of his nose. And to my horror, he grabbed that piece of skin and began peeling it off of his face. I covered my mouth as I stared at him, continuing to tear his face off, his laughter picking up in intensity as he stared at himself in the mirror. Blood started to leak down from his exposed skin. "What are you doing?" Rachel asked me. I quickly pulled my head out of the door and quickly pointed into the room. Rachel rolled her eyes and then poked her head into the room, and she quickly gasped and rushed into the room. "James, no, stop that!" she shouted, slamming the door behind me and leaving me in the hallway as doctor. Harrison's cackling picked up in intensity and volume. I couldn't take it anymore and quickly ran from the clinic. I nearly forgot my things from how quickly I fled. I haven't been back for a couple of days and I'm seriously considering quitting. All of this shit is not worth a paycheck, especially if I'm in danger of getting hurt or killed. I was nearly about to call the office with my resignation when I got a call first from Dr. Harrison, inviting me on a coffee date to explain everything. I was apprehensive about meeting Dr. Harrison for this coffee date. The only thing that made me want to take it was finally learning what the hell was happening, and a part of me was excited to be on a date with Dr. Harrison. Even after everything that I had seen at the clinic, including him ripping his own face off, a part of me was squealing like a teenager finally landing a date with her crush. And even if I did quit afterward like I wanted to, I would at least finally know what was going on at the clinic. With Wilson, the patients, Dr. Harrison, everything. Maybe even the lost and found thief. Normally, I don't take very long to get ready, but a part of me wanted to put more effort into this meeting. In my head, it was going to be the last time I ever saw Dr. Harrison. So I put on my nice pair of jeans and button up, surprised that it still fit me since the last time I wore it was during my cousin's wedding. A quick spritz of perfume and I was ready. And in my head, I felt stupid. It wasn't like this was an actual date, but I figured I might as well take advantage of it. I was happy that I was allowed to choose the coffee shop and picked one close to the city and further away from the office. I wanted to be around as many people as possible and was happy to see that the shop was pretty busy. I took a seat at a table near the window to look out to see Dr. Harrison when he finally showed up, and so others could see us in case something happened during our date. I sat there and began to shake my legs anxiously as I waited for him to show up. I didn't have much longer to wait when I saw him approaching the coffee shop. It was so off-putting to see him in clothes that weren't his scrubs and lab coat. A turtleneck wasn't something I ever knew he would wear, but seeing him wearing that was enough for me to immediately know that I had made the right choice in accepting this date. "Good morning, doctor," I told him as I stood up from my chair when he entered the shop and walked over to me. He looked at me and gave me a soft smile as he rubbed his hand through his brown hair. "You can just call me James, Maggie. We aren't at work at the moment," he said with a little chuckle. It was a force of habit. It's like trying not to call your old teacher Mr. or Mrs. "Have you ordered yet?" "I know I have. A lot of explaining to do to you." I shook my head and he led us over to the barista. He ordered a simple black coffee and I got a basic latte. "You can judge me all you want, and you'd be right. I'm basic." We both sat down at the table and stared awkwardly at our coffees. It was obvious that he was trying to find the right words, so I just sat there taking small sips from my latte. Finally, he cleared his throat and looked at me with those beautiful green eyes. "About 5 years ago, I was attacked." He sighed heavily, lifting the hot black coffee to his lips and taking a small sip. "I was attacked by a patient. She wasn't satisfied with the work I gave her. I had told her that I could no longer operate on her because she was clearly addicted to cosmetic surgery. She didn't take the news well." He took another sip from his coffee cup. "What did she do?" I asked him, trying to imagine how her attacking him had led to everything that happened at the clinic daily. If I can ask that, of course. I cushioned my invasive question, but Dr. Harrison didn't seem to mind, giving me a small little smile. "She threw a cup of acid at my face, sliced it up real good with a scalpel, and as a chaser lit it on fire. The only reason I'm still alive is because Rachel threw mop water on me to put out the fire. The acid was harder to wash off," he explained, the smile still on his face, but his eyes betrayed just how traumatizing it had been for him. I looked at his beautiful face and didn't see a single scar or any blemish. Then, of course, I thought back to him ripping his face off back at the clinic. And it suddenly all hit me at once. His need for skin, him coming into work with his face covered up. "That isn't your real face, is it?" I asked him, placing my drink on the table to stare at him. He looked at me in the eyes and I stared into those big jewels he had. A soft swirl began to appear in his eyes and my head began to throb suddenly. "It isn't." He looked back down at his coffee and my headache disappeared the moment his eyes were taken off of mine. But for an entire year, I was in recovery, and even though I got reconstructive surgery, that fucking bitch, Ruined my face, he shouted, quickly looking around at the other patrons who snapped their attention over at us. Sorry, he said with a heavy sigh. But if this isn't your real face, how did you get it? I asked him, doing my best to avoid his eyes. As beautiful as they were, something about them suddenly began to rub me the wrong way. I gripped my cup close to me and kicked myself for not getting something hotter. If he tried something, I could at least throw scolding hot coffee in his face as a defense mechanism. It's a long story. He looked down at his cup of coffee and pushed it further away from himself, staring down at the table for a long while as he gathered up the courage to tell me. After she attacked me, I lost my mind. In more ways than one, he gave a little giggle before he quickly stopped and cleared his throat. He let out a heavy sigh. The embarrassment and shame he was feeling was palpable to me. I started killing people to give myself the satisfaction of having a better-looking face. It sounds stupid when I say it, but I earnestly thought that it was helping me. He continued to stare down at the table, while I stared at him in shock. He had broken the Hippocratic Oath and the fucking law as well. James, that doesn't answer my question, I told him, thinking he was deflecting. Oh, I'm getting to that. See, after I had killed my parents, I couldn't help but let out a gasp and quickly covered my mouth. My mother, she insulted my face, so I hacked her to pieces. And my dad was so in love and attached to her that I couldn't let him live in a world without her. He explained with a nonchalant shrug. But soon afterwards, I met my savior. He explained with whimsy in his voice. It suddenly clicked in my head. The man on the phone? I asked him. He finally looked up from the table and nodded enthusiastically, his green eyes shining so brightly I thought he'd blind me. Mr. Sinclair found me and put me in touch with someone who gave me powers to sculpt my beautiful face back. He reached his hand to his face and let out a happy hum. He was like a giddy schoolgirl talking about her high school crush, or like how I talked about him. And I'm sure you've noticed my beautiful eyes. It's hard not to, I'm sure. He giggled a little. His demeanor was completely different than normal. The smooth, almost aloof, handsome surgeon had transformed into a deranged madman before my eyes. The ease with which he told me he killed his parents and other people terrified, and all the while his eyes began to drill into my very soul. You're very special, Maggie. You have a healthy self-image. That's what drew me to you. My eyes, they can control people with low self-esteem and people who are easily manipulated. Hypnotize them almost. But you, I can't control you. I can suggest some things to you, but I can't control you, he told me. His eyes gleamed brightly, and I snuck a peek at them. I stared deep into them, and to my surprise saw spirals in them. I was gifted with these eyes and with the powers to meld skin. He smiled widely, and suddenly he reached across the table and grabbed my hands. I flinched backward, but he held onto my hands tightly. I use other people's skin to replace my own, and I can meld the human body into any shape that I want. People were starting to look at us now, and some were even murmuring. I prayed that one of them would come over here and get me out of this situation. Doctor, you're hurting my hands, I squeaked in pain as he squeezed them. That seemed to snap him out of whatever state he was in. His eyes dimmed, and he looked down at his own hands, and he quickly let go of them. I'm sorry, Maggie, he told me, instantly retreating into his seat and frantically pushing his hair back into place. I got carried away. He reached out and grabbed his cup of coffee and took a long sip from the cup. I rubbed my own hands and looked down at them. So, it isn't permanent, is it? You need to keep doing it? Taking people's skin? I asked him, trying to get him back on track and hoping that he would maintain his normal composure. He looked back up at me like a confused puppy. Oh, yes. Unfortunately, it isn't permanent. Every few weeks I need to replace it. Nothing I've tried has been able to make it last longer. Not only that, but I can't control this power very well either. As you saw with Wilson and the last patient, if I don't concentrate hard enough, things go very wrong. He took another long sip from his coffee. That answered a lot of questions. Why Wilson was a goop monster and how the human body suddenly turned into a scorpion creature. An awkward silence again came over our table as I tried to process everything. My boss was a murderer, an evil plastic surgeon who had somehow managed to go underneath the radar. And yet, after this bombardment of information, I had a random thought that I wanted to know. What keeps stealing from the lost and found? I asked him as I started sipping my watered-down latte. He looked at me with confusion on his face, and then suddenly it clicked in his head, and he couldn't help but start laughing. That thing, you don't have to worry about it. It's mostly harmless, he said, and started laughing about it. I looked at him and couldn't help but worry about the fact he called whatever it was, it. That didn't do much to instill confidence, but I also thought about another important question. Why does Rachel hate me so much? I asked him. He looked at me after finishing up his giggle fit. He nodded and reached into his pocket, pulling his phone out, and pulled a picture up. He flipped it over and showed me. I took it from him and stared at it for a good long time. It was Dr. Harrison with another chubby woman. It took me a few seconds to realize that it was Rachel. I think she's projecting. I helped her lose all that weight and excess skin, but she also is projecting onto you. Unlike her, you're comfortable with who you are. She still isn't. She's more plastic than skin at this point. He sighed as he reached over to take his phone back. My mind was barely functioning now. Sir, I don't think I can work with you anymore. I told him after I took a few more minutes to collect all my thoughts. I just couldn't bring myself to continue working at the clinic. Fuck all the money, I no longer felt safe there, knowing what kind of person Dr. Harrison was. What? He asked in shock. No, I can't allow that, Maggie. His voice was drenched in desperation. His eyes lit up again, and my head began to throb like a hammer was being smashed into it. He was trying to get into my head again. Maggie, I can't allow you to leave. I refuse. He reached out and grabbed my hands again. I panicked and quickly reached out to the nearest object I could find. Yanking one of my hands out and grabbing a napkin dispenser, I smashed it against his face. You bitch! He screamed, standing up and staggering around. He looked at me with rage in those beautiful eyes. Where I had smashed his face, the skin was now dangling from his cheek, revealing heavily scarred skin underneath it. People were murmuring and talking, Doctor. Harrison flashed his eyes at all of them and growled like a cornered animal. What are you all looking at? Piss off! He screamed at them, and everyone went on their way like nothing even happened. I quickly stood up from the table and backed away from Dr. Harrison while he stared at me with anger in his eyes. I'm sorry, sir. I just don't feel safe anymore, I told him, backing up and searching through my purse, pulling out my pepper spray and holding it in front of me like a shield. I can't allow you to quit. I'd rather kill you than let you leave, he told me, grabbing the flap of loose skin and ripping it off with a sickening tear. More of his true face was revealed, more heavily scarred and misshapen skin. It was almost like looking at a real-life, the picture of Dorian Gray. Half of his face was stunning, but the other half was scarred and heavily damaged. After a small standoff with each other, Dr. Harrison lunged at me, and I deployed the pepper spray at him. I covered his face in it, but he still tackled me to the floor and began to strangle me. I choked and gagged as he applied pressure to my windpipe. I tried to pry his hands off of my throat, but his hands were like iron, and I couldn't get them off. The pepper spray seemed to not affect him, so in desperation, I reached up and began to claw at his face with my nails. He screamed out and quickly let go of my throat to touch his face, and while he did, I quickly shoved him off of me. Standing up and sucking in air, I quickly ran out of the coffee shop, with Dr. Harrison screaming after me. I managed to reach my car and quickly started it up, peeling out of the parking lot and almost hitting some pedestrians on my way out. In panic, I called the only person I could think of to help me. Why are you calling me fat ass? Rachel asked me as I started driving towards the clinic. I thought you were on a date with Dr. Harrison. She sounded extremely jealous, and if he hadn't just tried to kill me, I would have understood where she was coming from. Listen, you bitch, I know you used to be fat too. Now shut the fuck up and help me. Dr. Harrison just tried to kill me, and I damaged his face and he's probably going to kill me, and I need your help. I begged her, gripping the steering wheel tightly. There was a good long pause. Meet me at the clinic, Mr. Sinclair should be here soon, and he'll be able to calm him down. She sighed before hanging up on me. I let out a soft sigh and sped up slightly to get to the clinic. I arrived soon afterward and quickly ran to the clinic door after parking. I was thankful to have a key and I quickly slipped in. "Hi, Maggie, I thought you didn't work today." Wilson was surprised to see me, but he was also happy to see me. I quickly waved at him and ran past him, quickly sitting down in my seat and letting out a long sigh. Just as I sat down, something hit me in the head. It was small, and before I could register what it was, another thing hit me in the head. Looking around, I saw that 2 bottle caps had hit me in the head. I looked over to the lost and found box and noticed that several items were moving around. I carefully and sneakily rolled my chair over to the box and peeked inside. I saw an item that I knew for a fact had never been in there before, a burnt piece of bread. And to my confusion and shock, it was moving around in the box looking for something. It was walking around on black noodle-like appendages and was speaking in squeaks and hisses. Hi?" I tried talking to it. It stopped dead in its tracks and turned to look at me. It had several human eyes stuck to its crust, and all of them stared in various directions. Once they all landed on me, the bread creature let out a loud screech. Just as quickly, it grabbed some random keys from the box and ran out of the box at speeds that would make the Roadrunner jealous. I couldn't even process what had just happened. A burnt piece of toast with human eyes and noodle appendages had been stealing from the lost and found box. As I sat there trying to process what I had just seen, Rachel finally entered the clinic and walked over to the desk to meet me. Her usual bitch demeanor was different. She seemed like a normal person for the first time. "Good, you're not dead." She sighed, looking back over at Wilson and motioning for him to come over. "Mr. Sinclair should be here soon, and he can usually talk sense into Dr. Harrison, so we just need to hold him off until then." She looked over at Wilson, who finally made his way over to us. "Wilson, make sure not to let Dr. Harrison through, okay? Otherwise, I'm turning the heater on," she ordered him. Our security guard gave us a salute and quickly made his way back to his position, locking the door and standing near the door, like a dog who knew someone was about to enter. "So, he told you, huh?" Rachel asked me as she tied her hair up in a ponytail. I looked over at her and nodded a bit. I tried to imagine her as the lady in the picture. There was no indication that she had ever been anything but a thin bitch. "You hate me because I'm fat? Or are you just projecting on me?" I asked her, keeping a side eye on the lost and found box, not sure if the bread thing was hostile or not. "Or maybe a little bit of both," I asked her with a little giggle. She sighed and leaned on the desk to get a good look at me. "It's probably both. I had so many insecurities, and here you are, just as happy as could be. It pisses me off. Even after I got the surgery, I still don't like myself. Maybe that has part to do with what I helped Dr. Harrison do." She sighed, rubbing her face and groaning softly. "What does he do exactly?" "Obviously, I know he skins people, but how do people keep coming back here?" as I asked her. "He replaces it with silicone. Even me, I'm more plastic than a Barbie at this point." She looked over at the door quickly when someone started trying to get inside the clinic. When angry knocks started pounding at the door, we both figured that it was Dr. Harrison. "Is that plastic skin stab-proof?" I asked, quickly looking around for some kind of weapon to use to defend myself. "No, unfortunately," she told me as she took her purse off and placed it down on my reception desk. She fished through it and pulled out a taser. I looked at her with a raised brow and she shrugged at me. "When you're this pretty, you need something tougher than pepper spray." "Pepper spray didn't work on him," I told her, rolling over to the lost and found box and searching for something to defend myself with. I picked up a small pocket knife and quickly blew the breadcrumbs off of it. It was going to have to do. "Let me in, goddammit!" Dr. Harrison screamed from the other side of the door. I looked over at Rachel, wondering what her plan was. I didn't get a chance to wonder because Wilson simply opened the door for him. "Wilson, what the fuck?" Rachel shouted. But one look at him told us that he had unfortunately locked eyes with Dr. Harrison. He meekly stepped aside after opening the door and Dr. Harrison rushed into the room. His beautiful face was gone, replaced with the heavily scarred and damaged face he had described. His right ear was gone, his hair was in clumps growing from his head and he had no eyelids to speak of. That woman had done horrible damage to his face, and I could almost feel sorry for him if he wasn't about to try and kill me. "Sir, I need you to calm down, please," Rachel told him, pointing her taser at him. He stared at her like a rabid animal and looked down at the weapon pointed at him. He walked over to her, and she slowly began to lower the taser. I looked over and let out a whimper when I saw that his eyes were shining again. I hoped that Rachel might be able to resist as I could, but she wordlessly got out of his way as he continued his approach over to me. "Maggie, I can't let you quit. I won't let you," he told me, his eyes burning with anger and the swirls on full display as he tried to get to me. My head throbbed, and I quickly swung around in my chair and ran out into the hallway toward one of the operating rooms. He screamed after me, and I slammed the door, quickly locking it and even pushing a chair up against the door. I was trapped, and I had no way out. I started to look around for anything that might help me, but all the cabinets and tools were locked behind keys that only Rachel or Dr. Harrison had. In my search, I suddenly noticed a black spot on the wall. It almost looked like mold, but as I walked over to examine it, it grew rapidly in size. And before my eyes, I watched as a pale and blond man stepped out from the now giant stain on the wall. He was the most well-groomed man I had ever seen, and with giant bags under his eyes, he also looked like the most tired man in the world. He looked around the room and then over at me. He stared at me like he found a cockroach in his soup. "You're the receptionist who called me?" he asked me as the stain disappeared behind him and slithered into the shape of his shadow. I nodded at him and figured that this was Mr. Sinclair, just as I had been introduced, Doctor. Harrison began banging on the door. "Maggie, open this fucking door," he screamed, slamming his fists against the door. Mr. Sinclair sighed as he rubbed his tired eyes. I stared at him and then down at his shadow. I was shocked to see two bright white eyes staring back at me from his shadow, and a giant white grin came across the shadow's face. Sinclair walked up to the door, moved the chair out of the way, and opened the door. Dr. Harrison slashed down with a scalpel, but Sinclair caught him by the arm and stared down angrily at him. Dr. Harrison quickly snapped out of his rage and stared up in shock at Sinclair. "Sir, I..." He tried to say something, but no words escaped from his lips as he stared at Sinclair. "We talked about this, James. How big of a mess are you in now?" he demanded to know. Dr. Harrison looked at him again and sheepishly looked back down at the floor like a scolded child. "Let's go to your office. We have a lot to discuss." Sinclair walked past him after releasing his arm. Dr. Harrison looked over at me before dropping the scalpel and following after Sinclair like a puppy. Rachel walked in a few minutes later, rubbing her head softly and looking ashamed at having failed to help me, but I walked over to her and hugged her tightly, just happy that I was still alive and not sliced into pieces completely. Dr. Harrison and Mr. Sinclair stayed in the former's office for over an hour before Harrison walked out of the office and walked over to one of the operating rooms. Mr. Sinclair walked out of the office, puffing on a cigar and staring at me. He beckoned for me to come over to him. I walked over and instantly felt the pressure mounting on me as I walked over to him. "I understand you don't want to work here, but James has issues with people leaving him, and if you do leave, I cannot guarantee your safety," he explained to me. As he talked, a skeletal-like figure appeared behind him and smiled at me, gurgling and dripping black sludge on the floor around him. But I don't feel safe here." I tried to explain to him, but he held his hand up to silence me, and the creature gurgled again, almost like it was laughing at me. "I understand that, but I can offer you more money to keep working here and to keep him happy and, most importantly, out of trouble." He reached into his suit jacket pocket and pulled out his checkbook. I was going to turn him down instantly, and then he showed me how much money was being offered. I also specified that I wanted to ensure my safety while working here. He agreed and made sure to talk to Dr. Harrison about it, and I accepted that money, on top of my paycheck as well. And I'm still working here to this day. Dr. Harrison continues to fix his skin with other people's. But since I decided to keep working here, he hasn't flipped out on me once. And now knowing his secret, he does seem to be even friendlier to me. And even Rachel has been nicer to me, but she does still have her bitchy moments. But I'm more than capable of handling her. I don't feel good about working here. And now that I know what goes on here, I feel disgusting watching people get their skin taken away for Dr. Harrison to continue looking absolutely gorgeous. But the silver lining is the amount of money I'm earning. I can turn a blind eye to most of this. But some days I do think about quitting, and then I feel those green, glowing eyes staring at me, and I'm reminded that I'm stuck here. And that wraps up this part of I'm a receptionist at a plastic surgeon's. The deeper we go, the darker the secrets become. I hope you're enjoying this twisted journey so far. If you're as hooked as I am, make sure to like this video and let me know your theories in the comments. Don't forget to check the timestamps to jump back to any part. And of course, subscribe to Luis's Stories and hit the notification bell to catch the next installment as soon as it drops. Until then, keep an eye out for what's lurking in the shadows. See you in the next part.